Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode in the second installment of our Asia Thinker series. My name is Suzaina Kadir, and I'm here to moderate this discussion on reimagining education beyond COVID-19. This session is sponsored by the Singapore Global Network. We've known for quite some time that our traditional approaches to education and learning have been challenged. COVID-19 has, however, accelerated the disruption in education in ways we may not have been fully prepared for. In the blink of an eye, schools and universities were forced to move their classes online as concerns about the safety of students and teachers became very real. In some parts of the world, this transition seemed to, on surface, to be easy until parents, students, and teachers had to adjust to more than 1 week of learning in an online space. In other parts of the world, thousands of children were suddenly without access to basic education. We were also already aware that our notions of a compartmentalized learning, following a set time frame in preparation for jobs, were also being questioned. COVID-19 has, if I can be allowed to say, put the question of our readiness for a digitalized world front and center. We do now wonder if what we have in our curriculum and our assessment systems are in fact ready, or or have they simply become obsolete? To get us started with the discussion today, we are truly privileged to have two esteemed individuals to share their vision about the education landscape of the future. They are both very busy people, so we are indeed very thankful that they have set aside the time to spend it with us. Let me first invite Minister Lawrence Wong, Minister for Education, to share his thoughts on what a reimagined educational landscape will look like. Many of you know of Minister Lawrence Wong's impressive accomplishments. He has held positions in the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Community Information, Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, and the Ministry of National Development. He is, of course, co-chair of the Multi-Ministerial Task Force on COVID-19. Minister, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Suzaina, and it's really a pleasure to join you and Mr. Prajesh on this forum today. There is no doubt that COVID-19 has changed our education landscape, and there is really no turning back to the status quo ante. The biggest change that we are all experiencing now, front and center, is the impact of technology. And, COVID-19 has hit us. It has caused many schools to be closed, disrupted learning. But the silver lining in all this is that we also now see the tremendous potential for online learning and how this can significantly improve learning outcomes. And all of this has been done in a very compressed time frame. Part of this sudden wake up, if you will, for the education sector is the reality that we have not really harnessed the full benefits of technology in education over the years. To take a comparison, in the healthcare sector spends about 17 times as much on innovation and technology as education. 17 times. Private sector, venture capital funding in fintech, in health tech, in food tech are a lot more vibrant than in ed tech or education tech. And so I think arising from all this, we now have renewed interest in the role of technology in education. And it goes beyond just putting some content online and having remote learning. It goes far beyond that. There's a lot of potential, for example, in using data analytics and artificial intelligence to allow for automated grading. And the technology is much more sophisticated now than filling up these little black boxes and putting it through a machine. You can do a lot with automated grading, and you can do a lot to have better assessments of how every student is doing. And that means that it opens up many possibilities of more customized or personalized learning, where teachers can even design specialized learning plans based on how each student is doing. So these are just some illustrations of how technology can truly transform education. It will be a tremendous enabler in allowing us to reimagine the new possibilities for taking education to a new level. But I think we all also recognize that technology cannot replace human interactions. Teaching and learning ultimately remains a social and relational process. Robots will not replace humans in the way we teach and learn. And that's why I think everywhere around the world, there is now renewed interest in this idea of a blended model of learning or hybrid model. In fact, this idea of a blended learning is not new. We've been talking about it for at least 10 years. But again, because of COVID-19, there is now renewed interest in how we can harness the full benefits of it. Blended learning sounds very easy to do, but it is really, the devil is in the details and in the implementation. It goes well more than just saying, let's have 1 day a week of learning from home. That in itself doesn't constitute really hybrid or blended learning. It really requires a rethink of pedagogy and instructional design and how best to integrate digital devices into the lessons. And it also requires teachers and instructors to come alongside and be trained in this new way of teaching. So this is the journey that we are taking now in Singapore. We are learning from the experiences of what we had gone through, which we call the circuit breaker, where students learned from home, where teachers had to adapt very quickly to this new experience. And we are now thinking through how we can implement blended learning into our education system starting next year. And we want to do the very best we can to enhance our model of education for the benefit of every child in Singapore.
Thank you, Minister. You've raised some excellent points. I'll come back to that when we get into the discussion. But let me now invite Mr. Bragesh Pant. He is Chief of the Education Sector Group of the ADB to share his views. He has had over 25 years of experience in the education sector, including in sector assessment, project processing, implementation, evaluation, policy dialogues, covering all levels, all the way from elementary, secondary, technical, and even vocational education. There is no doubt he has vast international experience on the question of what this disruption in education means for us and what globally we might expect. Mr. Bragesh, over to you to share some of your initial thoughts.
Thank you very much, Suzaina. It is a great pleasure to be part of this program. Even before COVID-19, we were talking about research clearly showing that more than quantity of education or average years of schooling, quality of education as measured by students' learning achievement is closely linked to economic growth and innovation capacity of a country. Quality education also contributes to all other sustainable development goals. Despite impressive improvements in physical access to education, many countries serious improvements. Progress has been very slow. There is an urgency to find innovative approaches to scale up learning, just like the global initiative to support education for all. It is not only important to bring school-age children, particularly from disadvantaged groups, to school. It is equally important to ensure that all of them complete school education with foundational skills. This is very important. But the strategy that works to improve access may not work to improve learning, because learning requires deepening teaching and learning processes and mobilizing resources to monitor and support learning levels of particularly those that are lagging behind. So COVID-19 has exacerbated inequities and further deepened the learning crisis due to massive closures of schools and disruptions in learning. Our thoughts regarding building back better include 6 elements: ensuring learning continuity. The protracted closures of education and training institutions is exacerbating, as I mentioned, learning crisis to a learning catastrophe, according to a forthcoming report by Save Our Future campaign, which is a coalition of all major multilateral and bilateral institutions and civil society organizations. Education budget may be squeezed due to the current budget deficit, which will likely have serious consequences on learning and earning of future cohorts. To address this, we should think about covering sectors like education and training through second round of emergency and investment loans to prevent further deterioration. Such financing should also leverage traditional and non-traditional financing and domestic resource mobilization for greater synergy and ownership. Second, improving equity. COVID-19 has also exacerbated inequities. Students that were already lagging behind are at a greater risk of dropping out from education and training, and girls are particularly maybe at greater risk. More resources need to accompany better targeting vulnerable learners at all levels of education and training in close partnership with employers and private sector. Third, targeting workforce development. Many people have lost their jobs. We need to support programs on repurposing workers from low to high demand jobs and reskilling and upskilling, particularly most vulnerable workers, to find meaningful jobs at this difficult time. Next one is about expanding support to EdTech solution, which is at the core of our discussion. With an unprecedented surge in online learning, there is also a shocking realization how ill-prepared everyone is on this due to limited connectivity, inadequate digital skills, and lack of readiness of teachers and trainers to cope with the new reality. Being the biggest enabler, education and training play a transformative role in preparing teachers, trainers, and parents with digital skills to accelerate transition of countries to digital economy through a combination of short-term and long-term strategy. Next one is about promoting cross-sectoral collaboration. Governments are bleeding due to reduced revenues and increased expenditures on health, social protection, and economic recovery. To address this growing crisis, increased resources should also help to create much greater synergy across different sectors. Expanding access to internet connectivity with different packages for different users that will help transition to digital economy, blended learning, digital health, e-commerce, some of which needs to digital skills are not as noted above to support workforce development, expanding and better targeting social assistance that includes nutrition to children and other vulnerable groups. This is food security, cash transfers to parents, migrant workers, and so on, and rethinking capacity by involving universities. They are grossly underutilized in many developing countries and can contribute significantly through national and international partnership. And finally, promoting partnership to avoid duplication of resources and leverage additional financing. It is critical to build on existing partnerships and develop new partnerships to bring relevant expertise, capacity, and innovative solutions to support developing member countries of ADB and their emerging priorities. So these are the major backgrounds, and I will get into specifics about how technology can contribute in these different areas. Back to you, Suzaina.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Bragesh. Let's open the discussion. I thought I would open it a little bit with a set of questions. I would like to place my questions in roughly two areas. One area I think a minister has already talked about, which is pedagogical approach, how we think about learning and classroom design, and I'll come to that in a bit. But I thought I wanted to begin with a broad question around inequality and inclusivity. I think it's very clear with COVID-19, and certainly when we were, confronting the challenges with moving into this digital age, that digitization provided us an opportunity, right? It meant we could have greater access. It meant that things would be democratized, so to speak, right? But I think what we are confronted with, the very real possibilities that with digitization, we are going to see vast inequalities. I mean, one of the things that Mr. Bragesh had talked about was really with COVID-19, you see the sudden cutoff, right, of access to fundamental education for some parts of the world. And that's now a real challenge. So I guess let me begin with this question on the issue of the role that education plays and the future imagination of education in terms of serving as a social leveler, right? We are looking at education as possibility now, or the new mode of education is actually increasing inequalities. So my question on inequality, if I can direct it at Minister first, and then I'll come to Mr. Bragesh after that, is how do you think we have to address this question of inequality as we begin to reframe our education landscape, right? There are Our question on inequality, say in Singapore, looks quite different from some of the key considerations we may see in some parts of the world. We have the infrastructure. The infrastructure is quite well developed, but we are still consumed and worried about what this would mean for actually, increasing the gap within Singapore between different groups of students and also between different schools, possibly, right, and different educational institutions. So, what do we need to address or look at in order to address this question of inequality when we think about what education in Singapore will look like?
Well, Susanna, thank you very much for this very important question. It is always on our minds because we want to ensure that education remains an effective social leveler in Singapore. And COVID-19 has shown that schools are in fact an integral part of the solution to tackling inequality. Because as we just heard just now, the experience in many other countries and places have shown that with COVID-19, when schools are closed and classrooms are disrupted, there is devastating impact for many, many young people. And this just exacerbates the inequalities that are already present in society. So we are determined, first of all, not to even get there. And we have been fortunate that we were able throughout this period so far, largely to be able to keep our schools open, thanks to the tremendous efforts of our school leaders, educators, and administrators like yourselves. And we have been, we want to keep it this way. And we should not take it for granted that we can keep it this way. So it's a continuing challenge, first of all, to ensure schools remain open and to progressively resume more activities. Because keeping schools open is not just a matter of some online learning coupled with some classroom teaching. There is also a lot of interaction that happens in schools and universities and polytechnics. And when I visit some schools, the teachers lament that the canteens are now so quiet and the fields are now so quiet. And a lot of learning takes place with these sorts of interactions when students engage in sports, when students engage in their co-curricular activities. A lot of learning takes place in these environments. So we do want to resume these activities so that all students can benefit. And it's not only those with access to enrichment facilities outside of school that can still continue to benefit, but every child going to school will be able to benefit from this access to facilities that are present in our schools. But for now, we are unable to have all the activities, but hopefully over time, we can relax more of the restrictions and allow for more activities to resume. So that's one important priority. Second, you mentioned briefly digital access and how it might, cause inequalities. It's also an important area which we are very mindful of. So even during the circuit breaker, we were very concerned about this, and that's why the schools loaned out digital devices as well as mobile dongles, right, for students from more challenging backgrounds to be able to access the internet and to be able to make use of the digital devices to learn from home. And for those who really needed a conducive environment because their home environments were not suitable, we allowed them to come back to school. So we will continue to have that mindset in making sure that as we embark on further reopening of the school activities, as well as as we embark on this idea of blended learning, we want to ensure that every child will have access to a digital device and the internet so that they will not be left behind. And you would have heard we are accelerating a program to distribute digital devices to every child, every student in secondary school. That's one way we ensure that everyone will have equal access to IT and digital devices, and we can ensure everyone will have access to good learning outcomes. And then finally, I would say this sort of going beyond COVID-19, we are very mindful all the time that we need to continue to find ways to level up opportunities for for students from more disadvantaged backgrounds in our education system. And we do this through multiple ways. For example, we put in more resources to schools with a higher proportion of students with greater learning needs, as well as with who come from families with lower income. And we put in more resources, both funding to the schools, as well as ensuring the schools have some of the best teachers to take care of these students. That's one concrete way that we can help. Regardless of the schools that they are in, we make sure that the access to resources and to teachers are there. Secondly, I think we are also very mindful that every child is different and every student has different gifts. Some students may do well academically and they may progress on in that path. But some students have strengths that are not in the academic area and they may be much better at hands-on learning. And we should then provide them with a different pathway in order to progress and thrive in that pathway, using their hands and excelling in the areas of interest and in their abilities. So this is what we've been trying to do over the years, building up a system of multiple pathways which allow every child to go do excel and do their very best in what they are good at. And we are continuing this effort in our school system in Singapore.
Thank you, Minister. I'll come back to this issue of sort of giving access and ensuring that the different schools and the different institutions and therefore different groups of students are equally prepared, right? I think that I would agree a lot of effort has gone into actually creating now these multiple pathways. So we've had a head start, right? And in many ways, our transition has been, I won't say necessarily, I guess the word is not necessarily easier, but it's allowed us to move along with the disruption, right? So I would say we are slightly more prepared. My question, let me target my question similarly around inequalities to Mr. Bragesh, right? So Mr. Bragesh, you work in education in parts of the world where the development in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of these base questions about equalizing access and all that may not be as uniform, right? And in fact, what we are possibly seeing with COVID-19 is a deepening of that divide between urban, more developed areas of a particular country and really the rural areas. So we see that in rural areas, we really do see a cutoff, right? My question has been, we know the urgency, we know the importance of ensuring equal access, we know the necessary investment in this. What do you think would be the role of educational technology and in particular the edtech companies that are involved in this area in providing the necessary support for parts of the world in which we see the issue of access and equal access very problematic, right?
Thank you, Susanna. Let me reflect on the lessons emerging from the crisis in terms of implications for EdTech and get into about the things we can do. First, as I mentioned earlier, it revealed inherent inequities existing in the education systems, that the same students that were lagging behind are at a greater risk of lagging behind further due to inequitable access to internet and related support mechanisms, socio-psychological, this is also becoming very important. So multi-channel of learning is important depending on low-tech, mid-tech, and high-tech situations. So you mentioned about urban centers, rural centers, they have different access. Second, digital contents and assessments are not readily available for effective distance learning at such a scale. So we need to have continuous assessment. That is not necessarily easily available. And teachers need to also give feedback. How do you do that? Third, teachers are not prepared to manage distance learning because they were already trying to cope with different challenges. Now to shift to distance blended learning is acquiring other skills. So we have to give comfort to them and also the tools that will make them comfortable without increasing their workload. Fourth, the focus of learning shifted from school to home and to parents to support their children. Now, this is actually should be natural, right? We should not be surprised about that. So learning happens at school, outside of school, but we were not focusing that much outside of school, and a lot of effort was going into school level. So now this actually puts the context in a better way. And now we are saying let's look at how they are learning and what kind of connectivity there is. Fifth, we have ATS solutions that were more confined to private education suddenly got much wider acceptance in public education, thereby underscoring the importance of public-private partnership for such applications. This is very important. It was dominated by private sector and largely used by the private school systems or education system. Now, the public system has recognized the importance and also what can be done with that. Sixth, it has become clear that these lessons have to be supported by government policies to apply distance education more systematically by focusing on the promises of ethics solutions and distance learning. And as Minister Wong mentioned, blended learning, if we look at the principles of blended learning is twofold. One is if we look at Bloom's taxonomy of learning, at the lower order of learning, people can do that outside of the classroom. For higher order learning, you need interaction. You pose questions, real life problems and also challenges, so that the discussions can lead to meaningful solutions, options, very important. Finally, it has become clear that distance learning and ATEC solutions are not meant to replace face-to-face learning. And this is what Minister Wong also emphasized, and I would like to also mention that. This is compulsion at this point, not out of choice. In the long term, we are always looking at complementing face-to-face learning. And what the way we are looking at it is, therefore, there are 5 pillars of ATEC sort of landscape. One is government policies. I already mentioned that. Second is access to infrastructure. And there is initiative like UNICEF and International Telecom Union. They are sort of partnering to provide connectivity to all schools. That's the principle. And in the current context, it's just like providing access to textbooks. All kids need textbooks. Similarly, now we need, and this investment is not just for education. Education being an enabler will help countries to transition to digital economy and digital skills. So the teachers and schools need to be equipped. Schools and parents have to be equipped. And finally, the partners have to be brought into this thinking, so that we have a more comprehensive outlook for short-term, mid-term, and long-term solutions. If we take this holistic approach, I think we'll be in a much better situation to scale up solutions and see a faster progress in terms of learning and employability skills. Back to you, Susanna.
Thank you, Mr. Bragesh. I think both Minister Lawrence and Mr. Bragesh have talked about when we think about learning in the future, we need to have a holistic approach, that there are actually different actors on the scene. It's not just the students, it's not just the teachers. We've got to think about the infrastructure. We've got to think about the parents that have to come on board to support kind of this new mode that we are dealing with, and that this is the new reality, right? I wanted to move the question a little bit to a point that both of you has raised about what education has done previously, and the parts of the education landscape that we want to keep, right? That connection where education is a big part in helping the socialization process, in humanizing us, right? So when we talk about blended and hybrid modes, this is what we are trying to maintain, or that balance we're trying to maintain, right? And we want to keep it as we move forward into the future. So I wanted to bring the question to that, which is actually about classroom design, our pedagogical approach. What is it that we are imagining, and what needs to be in place? So let me direct the first question again to Minister Lawrence Wong about when we think about the future of the education landscape in Singapore, and we move in this direction that you mentioned. You talk about what blended learning design is, and you rightfully talked about the fact that blended learning is not just about introducing you to apps or all kinds of digital tools that you can do, right? It will involve face to face. It will involve some understanding of how the two will come together. It has to be specifically designed. And I was glad to hear that you talk about the possibility of us rolling out this design. My question would be, if we think about the way our teachers are trained and our schools are ready, how are we training our teachers into this blended mode? How are we preparing the schools? And I guess a question, my specific question is really with regards to our assessment systems. Mr. Bragesh had talked about our assessment systems that need to change to actually now account for this, such as continuous assessment. So are we thinking about shifting our assessment systems as well to now think about all these skill sets we have to introduce into this with, with the idea of a holistic approach to learning that will come?
Yeah, thank you, Susanna. There are a lot of questions in there. Let me take a step back and see if I can sort of provide some perspective in terms of our thinking on how we can take our education system forward. We are always thinking harder about how we can improve the system to better prepare our students for a new environment that is uncertain, rapidly changing, and full of flux. And what can we do better? We know that we have a system that is rigorous and has high standards, but I think we also agree that there is perhaps too much emphasis on academic achievements and certain milestone examinations. It's very rich and heavy in content. And we are always asking ourselves, what can we do to reduce that emphasis on academic achievements? Well, how can we reduce it and provide a better holistic environment for our students, including looking at things that are important like character, values, soft skills like creativity, adaptability, innovation. These become much more important for young people in this new era. So getting that balance right is important. We've already started making some moves. The things that you hear in the news in Singapore, where we talk about changing the way we do the scoring for our primary 6 examinations to reduce the emphasis on going after that last decimal point, removing streaming in secondary school, going for full subject-based banding, changing the admission systems for universities so that it's not just based on academic results, but we are focusing on aptitudes. These are all part of this broader shift that we are trying to achieve. And there is still more things that we are looking at to see how we can reduce curriculum content so that we can free up more space for teachers to focus on these other important aptitudes and skill sets. I would say, very often since I've come to MOE, the question many people ask me is, what should my child study in order to be better prepared for this new world? We somehow have this preoccupation with content, as though there is some special subject out there that if I were to study it, I will have, some advantage in this new world. But the reality is that any subject, any content that you study today will become irrelevant or obsolete in a few years' time. So I think content is important. Certainly we want content to be improved, to be updated, and to be relevant. But more important than content is, the mindset that we need to inculcate in our young people. And that mindset must be one of agility, adaptability, and the ability to keep on learning through life. And that's why we talked about skills future earlier. It's an important national imperative that we are rolling out. It's not just a slogan, it's really trying to get every Singaporean, young or old, to get on this mindset of lifelong learning and skills mastery. And to remind everyone, education doesn't have to be front-loaded in the first few years of your life. It shouldn't be. It has to be an ongoing journey, and more important than just studying for the exam. We should work very hard at having a system that instills in every child the joy for learning, the mindset of curiosity, and the constant hunger to want to keep on learning and doing better throughout their lifetime.
Thank you, Minister. I actually wanted to move to Mr. Bragesh and actually ask you, I mean, Minister has talked about all the things that need to happen in order for us to face this new world, right, in the education. It is, in my view, quite a substantial mindset shift. Actually, it's extremely difficult for those of us that have emerged out of a system that's in the current context is just rather old and traditional, right? I'm a product of that. I'm also a parent. I guess my question to you is, what are the key steps in thinking about this mindset shift, right? Where should we focus to bring this about? You've talked about government policy. You've talked about the issue of organizations that had come in to provide infrastructure. I guess my question to you has been about what we need to do with teachers. And how do we work with teachers to bring this about? That's one. And then in addition to teachers, it's I come back to the issue of the tech companies and this private public partnership that you mentioned, right? How do we really tap on that? And you actually mentioned something much earlier that I was very keen on, which is the role of the university. And I wondered at the end of it whether you could discuss what your views were in terms of the how much investment we need to be making in universities, particularly in parts of the developing world in the region, to actually bring about this shift. Mr. Burgesh.
Yeah, it's a very interesting field emerging, isn't it? And I think your sort of word about reimagining education, I think that's very important. So what does a future of education look like? And I think this is the right moment to think about, given the crisis and its impact. So I would first look at what we want to do in education, and going back to Minister Wong, basically we are talking about developing self-directed learners. There is nothing fixed. Things are changing, these things are innovating. So people need to feel comfortable about what they are learning, of their interest, and also to keep on maintaining that curiosity. So just imagine if a young kid, 6-year-old, continued that level of curiosity, maybe many people would become genius, right? But that erodes. And schools might even constrain the thinking because you put them in a different context. So basically, self-directed learners with 21st century skills and being able to become lifelong learner. I think that these are the things we are envisioning for the future. And as you mentioned, there needs to be some alignment also. But that we have to live with that situation. So I think first we have to look at higher education, how they are preparing. And we see that there are some interesting developments. For example, there is a program called Lambda in California, which partners with companies, and they don't charge upfront tuition to students, but they develop skills, and then after they get jobs, then they reach a certain level of income and they start paying. So that takes a lot of courage to have, conviction that we are preparing students for good jobs. So that is one thing. That related to that is the movement from academic thinking only to competency-based thinking, skills that are employable skills. So Christensen institution based in, again, California, is looking at how the higher education landscape is changing. So they are saying that it's not prestige-based alone, because prestige-based institutions are limited and very difficult to emulate. So what do other institutions do? They have to partner with companies. They have to look at what kind of skills are emerging. So if we look at the labor market system in many developing countries, now with technology, what is feasible is you can actually use artificial intelligence, big data to creep into databases of professional job portals, government database, and so on, to identify changes in occupations, what skills are emerging. So if you look at software engineer, the title may not have changed, for the past 30 years, but what a software engineer is doing is very different compared to what they are doing 20 or 25 years back. So that is one part. The second part is job seekers have their own skills profile. So they want to see where they can go, the pathways that Minister Wong mentioned. It's very important to understand the pathway. So with the current set of skills I have and the demand for the market, how can I adjust? And then the third element is linking with the training providers. So if we can engage employers, the more, the better. So that is the sort of higher education landscape. Now you retrofit the foundational part. So foundational skills are better developed early on. And what we are seeing is this 21st century skill, like soft skills mentioned earlier by Minister Wong, collaborates the 4 C's we talk about: creativity, critical thinking, communication. These are easier said than done. How do you measure that? Somebody might say, I'm very innovative. Others might say, no, you are not so innovative. So it is evolving. But I think what options like STEM education or STEAM education we're talking about can do is change the process of teaching and learning, the pedagogical packaging. So the inquiry-based, it can't just happen. So you have to base on real-life situation. Extracurricular activities become very important. So we have to change from more time on task to do the same thing versus to pause and ponder what is demanding in your context. How do you think, to solve this problem? So now, if you look at the edtech, companies, the biggest advantage is they are data-driven, and they build on big data analytics. They look at whether students are learning or not. How is the teacher's teaching pedagogy is linked to the performance of students. And as a result, you can generate a lot of good research to continuously improve. And it's not just the job of teacher or student alone. The system can then put together different pieces to complement. And that's how I think teachers get a lot of support, and universities being at the center of thinking, higher order preparation and so on, they can easily coordinate with governments. Government officials can have, exchange programs with universities, with private sector to continuously upgrade and remain current with the system. Back to you, Susanna. A lot of things, possible.
Can I just chip in one quick point, because what Mr. Pragesh said just also reminded me, and Susanna, you asked about what universities can do. I've been speaking to all our university leaders in Singapore, and they are very alive to this challenge and this need to transform our university education in Singapore. And they are doing various things. Number one, they are all working harder to strengthen their linkages with industry, right? We do not want universities to be ivory towers. They should be towers of excellence, doing first-rate teaching, world-class research, but also having that close nexus with industry, so that whatever the knowledge that's created from the universities will be relevant in making life better for everyone. So I think they are very mindful of that, and they are doing more in that front. But second, they are also reviewing their curriculum, thinking through getting the professors. And it's not easy. I'm sure you all know the challenges, getting professors who may be very used to doing things in a certain way across the different faculties to start thinking afresh. How best should teaching and learning be done at the university level? And one thing that the university leadership is trying very hard to do is to break down some of these academic silos and encourage a more multidisciplinary approach, especially at the early years of an undergraduate's education journey. Provide them a broader a broader base of learning. Single specialization is still important, but I think a lot of the research shows that the more exposure a student has in terms of different disciplines, it really encourages that adaptability and agility of mindsets, which we all know is so important in the real world, where many issues are complex and cut across different disciplines. It cannot be solved by an engineer alone or an architect or a scientist. It really needs different skill sets to come together. So the universities are all working on this. NUS started consulting their professors on this, and then I suppose news leaked out and the media think they got a big scoop. That's fine, because actually it's much more than just one college. Right? It is really rethinking how university education can be better delivered. And it's not just in NUS, all the universities are thinking very hard about this so that we can truly provide a better education for our students. And beyond the universities, this similar review is also happening in our polytechnics and our institutes of technical education.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd like to move to the sort of open Q&A segment now. So I'll take some, we've got a bunch of very great questions from the audience out there, which I'll come to in a bit. Before I get to that, I wanted to just flash that we actually conducted a poll on Facebook asking actually a key question about whether, our audience thought that the changes brought on by COVID-19, this disruption in education, is ending up being a positive force versus a negative force. In some sense, I think the results were not too surprising, but it was quite interesting that those that responded to on Facebook actually or used Facebook as the medium actually thought it was positive, and then those that responded versus on Twitter and LinkedIn thought it was negative in terms of its overall impact. So I just wanted to flash that. I've got a whole list of very great questions here, but I thought I wanted to begin one directed at Minister, and I thought this is a great question. The question is, where should we be placing educational technology or EdTech in Singapore? Is it something that should be placed squarely within MOE? Or even NIE, or should we be thinking about innovation clusters, which involve different communities coming together? And how prepared are we to embrace this idea of sort of these innovation clusters when we think about education in Singapore? Maybe Minister, you wanted to answer that, and then I'll raise one to Mr. Burgesh.
Sure, I think it's not binary, and these are not mutually exclusive options. Certainly within MOE, we look at technology as an important enabler. And technology is not an end to itself. It really is a means towards delivering better education. So we don't start with technology. Let's start with our human needs. Let's start with a student-centric approach and what's best for our students. And then let's start thinking about how technology can help in achieving better learning outcomes. And within that context, EdTech certainly has a role to play. And that would include, public-private partnerships and working with the private sector and so on and so forth. Of course, beyond MOE's needs, you could have very vibrant innovation clusters of EdTech emerging as an economic engine in its own right. I mean, you could have private companies coming in, venture capital funds may come in and they can invest in edtech companies. I think that's fine, and that can provide a very vibrant new economic cluster. But I sometimes am a little bit careful about commercial incentives intruding into the education space and perhaps coloring what our objectives are. So let's be very clear from an MOE point of view, our objectives are not economic. Our objectives are student-centered, what's best for our students, and we will work with all partners, all technology companies to see what's the best way of harnessing technology in order to deliver better outcomes for our students. I'm also very mindful that when we talk about learning outcomes, there are downsides to technology too, right? It's not, and we talked about digital access issues, but it's not an access issue. The issue with technology are concerns about excessive screen time, digital addiction, and mental well-being. These are very important issues to deal with. And a lot of research, for example, has shown that for young children, you get better outcomes from face-to-face learning rather than learning from a screen, right? Because at a very young age, you learn better from a social and relational point of view rather than through a screen. And that's one reason, for example, why when we decided to introduce digital devices for every student, we did it only starting with secondary students rather than with primary school or even younger, lower primary students, because we were very cautious and mindful about understanding better the impact of technology usage on young people. So these are risks that we should be mindful of and find ways to mitigate these risks while we harness the full benefits of technology.
There are a few questions here with regards to digital divide, inequality, and I'm going to group them together a little bit and then direct it at Mr. Bragesh. There's actually a very specific question on addressing the potential digital divide within a South Asian context, between the countries within South Asia, how we might want to tackle that. But I thought a more interesting question was really one asking about how e-learning actually would deprive students who are not academically driven necessarily, without not just with not having access to the infrastructure, but even those who had some access to the internet but who are not interested in working in that space would simply just switch off. And so the question is, for parts of the world in which this might be a great problem, how might we tackle this challenge?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very good question, and it's there is no right answer, and we're still learning about these developments. But I think first of all, the divide. I think in the short term there are limited options, as I mentioned earlier, and we need to look at multi-channel, as I mentioned earlier. So even printed materials, looking at radio, TV. I see a lot of initiatives in different countries. We're talking about Uzbekistan, I mentioned earlier, a workshop we had earlier today. And almost 100% households have TV. So this is happening in Bangladesh, where also dedicated channels are offered. And then in city centers, again, Tashkent, Uzbekistan's capital, almost over 90% schools have connectivity. But if we look at outer areas, less than 20%. So that's a huge gap. And the only way you can do that is employing multi-channel in the short term. Now, the second part of the question is about how to tune in, how to excite students. Now, that's a very difficult part, and particularly giving feedback if schools are closed. How do you do that? Now, there may be different ways. Teachers have contacts, schools have contacts of students. So a telephone conversation, or even parents, in many cases, internet connectivity for laptop or other types of devices may not be there. But telephone conversation can help. And as I mentioned earlier, print materials, delivery. So e-commerce is thriving, right? So if it works for delivering different goods and services, it can also work very well for education. And the network of education is quite robust. It's just that the systems are not used to that. And finally, I think it's also important to develop, I think going back to our earlier discussion about materials that are exciting. Textbooks are often loaded. And we have seen efforts to complement, supplement materials. And supplementary materials are used better because they follow stories to excite students. They provide, interesting backgrounds, problems, and that's how I think we need to look at. And this is basically the time to also learn from good lessons from different countries, because in crisis you find also creativity, initiatives. And I think this is the time where we see a lot of good initiatives happening naturally to solve the problem. So back to you, Susanna.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions here around the role of the private sector, or this private partner, public partnership that we mentioned earlier. And I'll raise it here directed at both of you. The questions have been really around the extent to which the private sector should be involved in the provision of education, particularly when we look at education as a public good. On this, earlier we had talked about edtech companies, right? The big players out there that are on the scene. But the question here is really about the smaller players. How should governments be partnering with them, and the extent to which they should be actually part of thinking of this future in education? There's a very specific question, I think, that's directed at Minister, and that is with regards to the private educational institutions and the role they play, particularly in the Singapore context. So it's really about private-public partnership. To what extent do we embrace this moving forward, and what are the central roles they can play, particularly on an area as sensitive as education, for example?
Well, the education system in Singapore is an open one. We have a largely public education system that serves the majority of students, certainly in their early years in primary and in the secondary school, and all the way to post-secondary. But at the preschool level, you've got a mix of MOE kindergartens as well as many private players are operating. And at the university level, you have autonomous universities as well as private education institutions. So it is part of that ecosystem. MOE focuses on the areas that are in the public space to ensure that we set good standards, high standards, and to ensure good learning outcomes for all our students. It is very hard for us to regulate standards and outcomes in the private sector. But what we do is we ensure that we have an EduTrust certification for private institutions. And then we publish indicators, right? We rely on publication of indicators, outcomes, so that students have a choice and students can choose what role or which institutions they would like to go to. So I think it's an open system. Private sector is part of the system today and will continue to be part of the system tomorrow. And they can contribute either as a provider for students, or they can now also contribute as a provider of training for adult training, going beyond just someone in the school years. They can go into the adult training space, for which we also have a range of training providers, not just the public sector. And they can also contribute in the area of providing solutions to public institutions. So you are not training or delivering a program per se, but you are, as we said just now, providing solutions. It could be technological solutions, or it could be other packages or other solutions that complement the education system. For example, in our schools today, we have student care centers. And these care centers are run not by the government, but by the private sector. So I think the scope of where public, what the public institutions have a well-defined role within the Singapore context. It is indeed a very large role. We occupy quite a fair bit of it, and I think rightfully so, because this is education after all, and we want to make sure we allocate significant resource to invest in every child. And these are important investments because human resource is the only resource we have in Singapore. But we certainly welcome the role of the private sector to complement what the public sector is doing.
Mr. Burgesh, what's your view on the role of the private sector here?
So if we look at the Eptic, it's very short. It's not really long, and even if we look at PC, personal computers, it's past 40 years, and I think we should be also realistic about how we position and how we become critical about these developments. But I think I'm quite amazed. There are 15,000 or so apps. So how can a government choose? It's really difficult. So there has to be a principled approach. One thing that is quite interesting development because of COVID is, as I mentioned, it was mainly EdTech was dominated by the private sector, and public sector was not using it enough. And the private sector had to be within the regulatory framework. So their focus was also not necessarily mainstreaming, but complementing in certain subjects, in certain areas to bring value addition. But now, with COVID, there is now a different landscape. So there is wide recognition, EdTech is being mainstream, but we still have a challenge in selecting, identifying. So I think one principle perhaps to think about is any education system requires a learning management system. So that learning management system and using the principle of second generation, adaptive learning systems that EdTech, new generation provide, is basically to look at connecting teachers, students, parents, and system to monitor, how education is being delivered. So the efficiency part we should not underestimate, is also very important, but the learning part is particularly very important. And any government would like to have, to make sure that it's affordable, it's manageable in that sense. And they would also like to put in place the most effective aspects. So if we look at open source learning, Khan Academy stands out. There are also now new developments in assessment. So some are open source, but largely many are commercial. But if the commercial one is really effective, then perhaps governments should think about how to mainstream, how to take advantage of economies of scale and encourage that. So my point is, one is the learning management system that puts into account main providers, apps, and then you have others also. So for example, we talk about extracurricular activities. So somebody wants to learn more about drone technology. So that apps can be connected, So there is a choice provided to education systems, and that could be connected very well. That may have a price, but given the sort of scale and interest, it will be also of interest to providers to make sure they improve and make it attractive. So over time, everybody is winning. So it's like a music, streaming, where you have big companies allowing their platform for different companies to come and stream, but at a very low cost. So government, I think, can be a facilitator, but in partnership, because governments may not be very good in managing, technology or this kind of private sector coordination. So if it is done in a neutral manner and in partnership with government and providers within an umbrella structure. I think we are talking about pretty, promising development in the next decade or so to solve many of our learning challenges, and also in improving, for instance, soft skills. Because technology is also helping collaboration across borders with companies, with universities, with research institutions. So I think the potential is enormous. So I think, yes, private sector has a very important role to play, but they also need to recognize the scale and quality of learning. And it is better if they partner with public sector, and public sector needs to be more open to this idea. And it's a win-win for everyone. Back to you, Susanna.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Can I just make a quick
Minister.
point too, which is that the private sector can also play two very important roles. This is just building on what Mr. Pragesh said. Number one, providing very, very useful inputs to our public institutions. In Singapore's context, our polytechnics and universities, to help us understand better what our industry demands and industry needs, and shape the curriculum to be more industry relevant. Number two, private sector companies themselves can be training providers, training not only their own employees, but for the whole industry. And there are, obviously, not all companies can do that. In Singapore, we call them the Queen Bee companies. These tend to be the industry leaders. They are larger, they are already in the forefront of the industry, and they have the scale and the capability to train, not just for themselves, but for other people in the industry. And so the government, in our case, Skills Future Singapore, works with them, partners these companies to develop training programs. And these are very useful because there's no one better to understand and to know what the training and the industry needs are than the company that itself that's in the industry. And they are prepared to do this, not just for themselves, but for their whole industry. And you may ask, why would they bother to do that? Aren't they training people for their competitors? But I think they take an enlightened view, and they recognize that if you have higher quality people in the entire industry, it helps lift the whole industry, and it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And so, for example, I visited IBM, and they are starting or they have launched a data analytics AI program in Singapore in partnership with us. So we provide some funding, and it has been very fruitful, a partnership to provide industry relevant programs for mid-careers. And already other people in the industry, other companies, banks, IT companies are looking at the trainees, hoping to recruit them because they see the quality of the IBM program. They know that this is a good program. They trust that the graduates from that program will have industry relevant skills, and they can't wait to hire them. So I think these are all examples of how we can forge win-win partnerships.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. We're quickly running out of time. There are a whole slew of questions. We unfortunately will not be able to get to them. But I wanted to maybe approach it this way, to give you some time to round up, each of you to round up the discussion this evening. But I wanted maybe for us to round up by trying to fit one or two of these questions in that roundup. Okay, so we'll begin with Mr. Pragesh in his roundup before we move to Minister. And I think looking at all these questions, I think there are two key questions I wanted to sort of slot in. One is really about imagining the purpose of education. So purpose of education 20 years down the line with AI and robots very much part of our reality. How do you see that? And then secondly, I thought there was this question here, and I think it's useful for me to flag it. We've talked a lot about the private sector. We've talked about teachers. We've talked about the ministries and government. How can we include and place the voices of both parents and students in kind of reimagining education and putting in a place this kind of holistic approach moving forward. So maybe Mr. Burgesh, we'll begin with you, and then I will let Minister Lawrence Wong close us off. Mr. Burgesh, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sudaina. I think it's very important point you raised, the balance between human and machine. And this need not be a sort of a competition. Basically, this school of thought about human-centric development is at the heart of how we can blend the power of technology with the creativity of humans. I think this is critical for us, and it can be a win-win situation for all. What we have seen now is there are nagging challenges for many developing countries to improve learning, to leapfrogging development. And technology has affected other sectors more than education. And by nature, education is slow and difficult because it's also a large system and there are risks associated. But if students are not learning enough and if skills mismatches continue, I think the risk may be not that much compared to the promise we have seen. And the crisis is a big reminder for us about the compulsion to move into new technologies that will help many things. What we didn't discuss was, for instance, children with disability. There are technologies, assistive technologies, very important. Their life can transform. Very important to think about that. Similarly, in terms of understanding and seeing the world, the technology can bring that world at your laptop. Also, if you look at Socrates, Socrates was known for not any expertise. His basic thrust was questioning, asking questions, thinking, and he said, "I don't have any answers." But I think in this world, increasingly vulnerable, changing rapidly, people need to understand where they are and how they can address that challenge. And for parents, education has always been a enabler to create opportunities. And when they see constantly if the children are lagging behind, then there is a problem. They want to see their children achieve the best. And how do you do that? I think you have to employ as much as possible different possibilities. So technology, I think, can be one enabler to do that. But I think we are at the beginning of that revolution. My own prediction is that we'll see more of this happening with government's leadership, recognition, and private sector also seeing the crisis as an opportunity to convert, into new possibilities. Let me also take this opportunity to recognize, our partnership with Singapore institutions. Mr. Wong is here. We have partnership with Temasek Foundation International, National Institute for Education, Institute for Technical Education, and we are now working on a new partnership with Singapore Polytechnic to look at entrepreneurship and new areas like advanced manufacturing and so on. So that's very important. The Senior Minister Samanga Ratnam has also been very proactive and providing leadership in the Global Education Forum, which was held recently on the 10th of September. There's a big sort of concern and coalition of international partners to address these challenges. And I'm very optimistic that we'll be working together to find amicable solutions. And we need that partnership and trust of people like you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Minister, to round us off.
Thank you. Well, just to try and address also the two questions that you asked just now, I think the anxiety about a future where, it's full of automation, AI, robots, machines, and what does this mean for education and jobs of the future is very real. I often get asked this question when I meet with students, and I just keep on reminding them, yes, this fear is real, anxieties are real, but if you look at the broader arc of human history, we've dealt with this many times before. This is not the latest, this is not the first time we are dealing with technological change. We've been through many waves of technological change, and humanity has thrived and prospered. So I think we can approach the future with some confidence. And ultimately, to compete with robots in the future, we cannot become robots ourselves. There's no way we can beat the computer by becoming a better computer. So we really have to double down on our human strengths. And what are these human strengths? It really goes back to the basics, our ability to build relationships with one another, to work in teams and collaborate well, to be able to think creatively and brainstorm and challenge one another, and then develop better solutions together. It sounds like very simple stuff and things that we should all know how to do automatically, but I think we shouldn't take it for granted. And these are important skills that need to be nurtured, cultivated, and they are best done when we are in school, in universities, in a safe environment where we can do all of these things and practice and strengthen these skill sets. And then, of course, it must continue on in the workplace. And I think then this goes back to what's the role of parents and students. Very often, you hear from people that they would like the education to be the way to get my dream job. Right? Education serves a rather utilitarian function, which is it is to get my dream job. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it is indeed an important objective of education that it should provide you, equip you with all the necessary skills, both the technical know-how as well as the soft skills, which I just highlighted, in order to do better in life and to apply them in the workplace. But I would put to everyone that there is a higher order goal here, that learning can be for good. We also want to learn to be better human beings, to be better husbands and wives, to be better fathers and mothers to our children, and to just lead more fulfilling lives. So this idea of learning for good transcends whether on every job, right? Whatever job you're doing, have that mindset of wanting to be a better person, wanting to do better in everything that you do. And that ultimately, I think, is what education is about. And to achieve that, it really goes beyond our school system and teachers. Parents play such a critical role, and students themselves have to have that self-motivation. And later on, when they become parents, they need to pass on these mindsets and values to their children. So we hope, so that's why it really takes everyone, all of us, to do our part. And we hope that we can all move forward together in this journey of becoming lifelong learners and really embracing this mindset of continuous learning.
Thank you so very much, Minister and Mr. Bragesh, for joining us today and sharing your insights. Thank you, everyone out there, for participating. In many ways, we should no longer be reimagining education. I think the pandemic has given us this opportunity to know what the future of learning and what of education will actually look like. We just now need to articulate this in a way that help us maintain our humanity and ensure growth as a global community. I think that's what both Minister and Bragesh talked about. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thank you again, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzaina. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.